Thank you for that.
All right, so today we're going to do the editor's introduction to Bassui's Dharma talk on One Mind and Letters to His Disciples as part of the continuing series we're calling The Supreme Experience. And I'll just jump in. In the year 1327, toward the close of the Kamakura era, the strife-born, anxiety-ridden period of Japanese history that produced so many notable religious figures, the Rinzai Zen master Bassui Tokusho was born. Having had a vision that the child she was carrying would one day become a fiend who would slay both his parents, his mother abandoned him at birth in a field, where a family servant secretly rescued and reared him. At 7, Bassui's sensitive religious mind began to evince itself. At a memorial service for his late father, he suddenly asked the officiating priest, "For whom are those offerings of rice and cakes and fruit?" "For your father, of course," replied the priest. "But father has no shape or body now, so how can he eat them?" To this the priest answered, "Though he has no visible body, his soul will receive these offerings." "If there is such a thing as a soul," the child pressed on, "I must have one in my body. What is it like?" To be sure, these are not unusual questions from a thoughtful, sensitive child of 7. For Bassui, however, they were only the beginning of an intense, unremitting self-inquiry, which was to continue well into manhood, until in fact he had achieved full enlightenment. Even during his play with other children, he was never free of these uncertainties as to the existence of a soul. His preoccupation with a soul naturally led him to think about hell. In an agony of fear, he would exclaim, "How awful to be consumed by the flames of hell!" and tears would well up. When he was 10, he relates he was often awakened by brilliant flashes of light which filled his room, followed by an all-enveloping darkness. Anxiously, he sought for some explanation of these weird occurrences, but the replies that were forthcoming scarcely allayed his fears. Again and again he questioned himself. If after death the soul suffers the agonies of hell or enjoys the delights of paradise, what is the nature of this soul? But if there is no soul, what is it within me which this very moment is seeing and hearing? His biographer relates that Bassui would often sit for hours stewing over this question in a state of such utter self-forgetfulness that he no longer knew he had a body or a mind. On one such occasion, at what age we are not told, Bassui suddenly directly realized that the substratum of all things is a viable emptiness, and that there is in essence nothing which can be called a soul, a body, or a mind. This realization caused him to break into deep laughter, and he no longer felt himself oppressed by his body and mind. In an effort to learn whether this constituted true awakening, Bassui questioned a number of well-known monks, but none could give him a satisfying answer. At any rate, he told himself, I no longer have doubts about the truth of the Dharma. But his basic perplexity as to the one who sees and hears had not been dispelled, and when he saw in a popular book one day, "Mind is host and body guest," quote unquote, every one of his quiescent doubts was suddenly resurrected. Quote, "I have seen that the foundation of the universe is voidness. Still, what is this something within me which can see and hear?" he desperately asked himself anew. In spite of every effort, he could not rid himself of this obsessive doubt. Nominally, Bassui was a samurai, having been born into a samurai family. Whether he actually pursued the duties of a samurai, his biographer does not reveal. But it seems safe to conclude that Bassui's continuous search for Zen masters would have given him little opportunity and presumably as little taste for the life of a samurai. At all events, we do know that Bassui had his head shaved at 29, symbolizing his initiation into the Buddhist monkhood. For the ceremonial rites of a monk or priest, however, he had little use, believing that a monk should live a simple life dedicated to attaining the highest truth, truth, so as to lead others to liberation, and not engage in ceremony and luxurious living, not to mention political intrigue, to which the priesthood of his day was only too prone. On his numerous pilgrimages, he stubbornly refused to remain even overnight in a temple, but insisted on staying in some isolated hut high up on a hill or mountain, where he would sit hour after hour doing zazen away from the distractions of the temple. To stay awake, he would often climb a tree, perch among the branches, and deeply ponder his natural koan, who is the master. Far into the night, oblivious to wind and rain, in the morning with virtually no sleep or food, he would go to the temple or monastery for an encounter with the master. So strong was Bassui's distaste for the ceremonialism of the temple that many years later, after he had become master of Kogakuji, he always insisted on calling it Kogakuan instead, the suffix an meaning hermitage, as opposed to the more grandiose ji, meaning temple or monastery. In the course of his spiritual journeys, Bassui eventually met the Zen master through whom his mind's eye was to be completely opened, Koho Zenji, a great Zen Roshi of his day. The lesser masters from whom Bassui had sought guidance had all sanctioned his enlightenment, but Koho, sensing Bassui's keen, sensitive mind and the strength and purity of his yearning for truth, did not give him his stamp of approval, but merely invited him to remain. On his part, Bassui recognized in Koho a great Roshi, but declined to stay in his temple, taking a solitary hut in the nearby hills, and for the next month coming daily to see Koho. One day Koho, sensing the ripeness of Bassui's mind, asked him, "Tell me, what is Joshu's mu?" Bassui started to reply, "Mountains and rivers, grass and trees are equally mu," and Koho stopped him with, "Don't use your mind." All at once, his biographer relates, Bassui felt as though he had, quote, lost his life root, like a barrel whose bottom had been smashed open, unquote. Sweat began to stream from every pore of his body, and when he left Koho's room, he was in such a daze that he bumped his head several times along the walls, trying to find the outer gate of the temple. Upon reaching his hut, he wept for hours from his very depths. The tears overflowed, quote, pouring down his face like rain, unquote. In the intense combustion of this overwhelming experience, Bassui's previously held conceptions and beliefs, we are told, were utterly annihilated. The following evening, Bassui came to tell Koho what had happened. Hardly had he opened his mouth when Koho, who had despaired of ever finding a true successor among his monks, declared, as though addressing all his followers, "My Dharma will not vanish. All may now be happy. My Dharma will not disappear."
There it is. There it is. Sorry.
Koho formally conferred Inca on his disciple and gave him the Zen name Bassui, high above average, quote unquote. Bassui remained for 2 months near Koho, receiving his instructions and guidance. But Bassui, who had a strong and independent mind, wished to mature his profound experience through quote unquote Dharma combat with accomplished masters, so as to integrate his experience thoroughly into his conscious mind and into his every act, and to develop his capacity to teach others. So he left Koho and continued to live an isolated life in forest, hills, and mountains not far from the temples of famous masters. When not engaging them in Dharma combat, quote unquote, he would carry on his zazen for hours at a time. Wherever he stayed, zealous aspirants quickly discovered his whereabouts and sought his guidance. But feeling himself still deficient in the spiritual strength necessary to lead others to liberation,